Yeah, so, I think, the initial, inspiration of the film was my dad's film Watari Dori, Birds of Passage, which is on my Jichan and two other issei. And, I think for me, that was, I really kind of, on a personal level, realized that even just within our family, the power of documenting our stories. Even if it's just for our own family's sake. I think that film was the first time, I saw my Jichan as a kind of judo master, as a gardener. I had always heard of those stories, but by the time, I could remember, he was already a pretty older man, couldn't speak that much English, so our communication, we couldn't really talk that much. And plus, he's a, Issei himself, so that Japanese men at that age don't really talk much anyway, or that of that generation. Um, and so, I think for me, it was really like time travel. To be able to hear and see my Jichan, really was able, it was like me being able to travel back in time and kind of be with him and get a bit much better understanding of who he was. And so, I always wanted to do that, or had the idea of doing that, especially when I had kids myself. Same thing is that, my daughter is 4 and my son is 8.
Mm.
My father is 88, so I'm not sure, for sure they don't remember him as I did, and for sure, they don't really know his film career. So I wanted to not only document something for him, but as well as the general public, or at least within the Asian American community, or at least the film community, to understand his work, the significance he made. Um, and then also, you know, I I think I'm one of those sons that will always feel indebted to my parents. Um, I think I kind of joke and say, most people who make films about their parents is because they didn't get along with them. But I think for me, it's the opposite, right? Um, I'm very close to my dad. He's given me everything, and part of me, I'm so grateful for that. It's almost a burden of how do you pay back someone who's given you everything?
Mm.
And so I think on one hand, the biggest way is to make him proud and utilize all the resources and teaching and mentoring that he's given me. But with this film, I wanted to express that gratitude. I wanted to tell him how much I appreciated all that what he did for me, and also too how much I try to understand, where and why he's coming from. And I think in that process, um, he was able to tell me he was very proud of me, and also I was able to discover my dad's story and on a much deeper level. I think
Mm.
I always knew what he did, but I think throughout the film and our conversations, I have a much better understanding of why he did it, what was driving him and his creativity and his work. Yeah, I think, as a kid, that was I wasn't interested in film. I was really just interested in sports and football. So that was the one thing where we could both relate. I mean, he likes sports, but he mainly, was a UC because he was a professor at UCLA, because he went to UCLA. That's very much his school. And because I love football and grew up um, always rooting for UCLA. That was the one thing that I felt he was doing for me. So the games were more, I would enjoy the games and being there with him, but I think probably the most enjoyable part, looking back, was our drives to the stadium, to the Rose Bowl. Um, so, in Los Angeles, everything's far away and there's always traffic. So it's about an hour, at least an hour each way. And I think me and my dad don't, we, like a lot of father and sons or parents, we don't talk face to face about how we feel. Or, if Yeah, and so I think by driving, we're kind of in this enclosed space. We're both sitting next to each other, but we're both looking out the windshield. We don't have to look at each other, so it's a little bit more it's not as awkward. So I think because that was such a tradition and it was just me and him, that was really the time where we would really talk. And through all the phases of my life so we started going to the games when I was in middle school. So through middle school, high school, college, my 20s, my 30s, and then my 40s, or now I'm in my 40s, it really gave us that time and space to really talk and bond that we would normally never do. So for me, it was really the drives that were my best memories. Yeah, I think I was a UCLA, I went to UCLA for undergrad and I was an Asian American Studies major. And at the time my dad was teaching in both the film department and in Asian American Studies.
Mm.
So I really took the class, because I wanted an easy A. There was, it's filmmaking. I knew there was no reading requirement. I knew there was no written essays or tests. Um, but I think I gained more respect for my dad being in his class because I saw him as a professor for the first time. I think that whole time I'd either seen him mainly as a father or as a filmmaker, but I
Mm.
never saw him as a teacher in front of a classroom. And I think so being in his class, I saw him in his element as a teacher. I saw the way he was a master teacher. I saw the way other students really respected him. So I think being a student in his class, actually, I gained a lot more respect for my dad as a teacher. And I think it was a little awkward, but I think by that time I was very proud of my dad. And so I didn't hide the fact that I was his son. I was probably by then used to people assuming um, that I was getting privileges and getting things that other people weren't because he was my dad. So that didn't bother me. By that time, I was kind of used to it. But I think mainly it was seeing him in a different light really gained respected him in a different way. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I discovered while making the film. I think I always saw my dad as more of an activist or a professor or academic who was making films to fight racism, to speak out against what happened to Japanese Americans, to uplift the community, to break stereotypes, which he all did. But then by making the f while making the film, I realized that he was actually he needed it to do it for himself to process that childhood trauma and the trauma that he basically experienced throughout his life in terms of growing up in the US. So I think I really realized the function him as an artist. He used his filmmaking as a way of therapy, as a way of processing his own life, which actually helped me with that same approach with this film. I think for me, in the same way,
Mm.
most of my films up to this point was to document community, to preserve history. Um, and I think with this one, I really used this process to as very therapeutic for me in terms of uh, dealing with the anxiety of losing my dad and his mortality. Yeah, so he went to he had actually he had started a couple projects already before he went to UCLA Film School.
Mm.
But it was when he went to UCLA Film School and he met a lot of other Asian American filmmakers that he started visual communications. in 1970, and that was the first Asian American media arts organization ever. And so, uh, yeah, that they were very pioneering in terms of, they not only made films, but they did a lot of educational pamphlets, photography. So that's why they're considered media arts, not just film. But
Right.
they are really, and they were inspired by the Asian American movement. So at that time, there's this political consciousness going on amongst Asian Americans in the late 60s. And so part of that expression of that activism or that evolving identity was through the arts. So there was musicians, poets, painters, and visual communications did a lot of the photography and filmmaking. And yeah, it's continued today, for over 50 years. And very much they're the ones that um put on the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival, and
Oh,
that's all my films have screened there, and I continue to work with them through the festival. Yeah, that was really great because there's an annual pilgrimage. So, my dad went on that first pilgrimage, and ever since then, there's been an annual pilgrimage. So that's once
mm,
a year where, hundreds of people come. There's a program, and I think
mm,
that's great to be in community. But I think it was very special just for me, my dad, and my son Prince to go when
mm.
no one else was around. So my son Prince is the same age that my dad was when he was incarcerated at Manzanar. So I think that was the first time where I could kind of see Manzanar through a child's eye. I think and that my dad always talks about having this very ambivalent feeling about Manzanar because on one hand, that's the place that really, destroyed his life or, destroyed the community. Um,
Mm.
was the source of a lot of was his childhood trauma. But at the same time, because he was a kid, any good memories that he has as a kid, any nostalgic memories, all take place at Manzanar. So I think I never really I kind of understood that on a intellectual level, but it wasn't until I saw my dad with my son, playing games, goofing around, uh, so kind of seeing the three of us together was the first time I was able to see and imagine how my dad kind of saw and interacted with the land and the place as a kid. Yeah, I think that's something that also I never really knew before making this film was the level of internalized racism, self-hatred, and therefore shame about my Ji-chan that or my about my about his dad that he had. Um I think also I could tell that it's something that he still very much carries with him, that guilt. Um And so, I think for me, I could see how much my dad was still suffering from that and how he'll never get over that. So yeah, I think to me that's something that the camp, I think all the films about camp or about the Japanese American World War II experience, um, they don't talk about things like that of how it made you be ashamed of your own family or even hate your own family. Um, and I think so. Yeah, that was the first time. But at the same time, I think that is what I feel good about this film is that I do think my dad wished he could go deeper, make a film about his dad in a more raw, vulnerable, um, below the surface level. And I do think at least I was able to make a film about him in a deeper way. So I do think, in one way that is something that I was able to do that my dad wasn't able to do, or the one big regret that my dad had. I think this film um, makes him a little bit more at peace with that regret. Yeah, I think what, I think now as a filmmaker, I understand how hard of a project that was, right? Just to have logistically to get hundreds of people to volunteer to be extras, to even as a filmmaker to make a film um as there's multiple, it's a period, multiple period pieces, right? So there's quote unquote the present day, which is, in the late 70s. And then there's World War II, when they're leaving for camp. But then there's also before World War II when the Issei are working on the railroads. So just as a filmmaker to think of the logistics, the costumes, the locations, um, and to do that with, no hardly any budget, and also to do that when no one else had done it before. I think on one hand that's impressive. That's very impressive to me. But when I talked to my dad, the fact that no one had done it before, he said, really gave them a lot of freedom because there
Mm,
was no precedent, there was no expectations. Um, so he said, it was very creatively freeing. But at the same time, I think that was where his personal and professional life not conflicted, but all came together.
mm,
So that was, I think he had there was a point where he had to make a choice of his family or his career during that film because I was born because of me. And
mm.
I think he has a lot of regrets for of that film. I think he's a perfectionist. I think for all, for like most artists, it could always be better. There's always imperfections. But I think for that one, he made a conscious choice to be a good father, to be a good husband. And like he says in the film, like uh, he'd rather do, make a mistake on the film versus making a mistake as a father. And so that's helped me as a father now trying to balance my own career and having, so my daughter, that was another full circle moment is, there's multiple. So one, I would my dad was the same age I am now when he made Watari Dori on his dad.
Right.
My son is the same age he was when he went to camp. And then I
Mm,
was born in the middle of production with Hito Hata, and my daughter was born in the middle of production of this film. So I think that experience kind of gave me a lot of, well, him having that experience, he was able to really relate and give me good advice of how to balance family and work. Yeah, I think it's again now that I'm married, have a career, have kids, it's even more impressive because I think that it takes a lot of strength on a relationship to both be married and working together. But they're very much a team.
right.
That's why I think it's really filmmaking is kind of like a family business, right? Like so I think uh it really shows the strength of their relationship. But it also shows how my dad really lived what he was trying to do, and he lived his art, and he lived. So I think for him, his professional and creative world and his personal life were all the same. They weren't compartmentalized. And I think that's really unique, and probably is why my dad was able. That's kind of the recipe for his longevity, right? I
Right.
think he's been committed to making specifically documentaries on specifically the Japanese American community for so long, but I think it's because it was all the same to him. It was the way he was living his life, both personally, as well as, creatively. I think, for sure I want the audience to know who my dad is. I think, and to hopefully look up his other work, because I think the film only, documents about half his career. He had a whole, he built the ethno communications program at UCLA. He built the Media Arts Center at the Japanese American National Museum.
Mhm.
Um, but I want people to know my dad's work, but also I think I want to show through him and his story really how much racism or the Japanese American experience in World War II really can really destroy you, and on multiple levels, and that you don't quite ever get over it. But at the same time, using my dad as an example of how you can at least use the arts to process it, or more importantly, the need for community to collectively process it. So while just like with Parkinson's, there's no cure for racism, but I do think it's about how much can you heal. And in my dad's case, it's using the arts and community to heal from that trauma.